This Sunday's Gospel is the Passion according to Matthew, chapter 26, verse 14, through chapter 27, verse 66. It is too long to give an audible reading here, so what I would like you to do, my friends, is to please read this passage in your own Bible. You can either do that at the end of this presentation or pause it now and begin. As far as our Christian tradition is concerned, nothing is more ancient as the Passion story of Jesus. The earliest form we have of this tradition is found in the 7 undisputed letters of Paul, the earliest New Testament documents. Specifically, the report comes from 1 Corinthians, written probably no later than 55 Common Era. Please note the section highlighted in red on the screen. This is 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 3b through 5. Even though Paul wrote 1 Corinthians probably in Ephesus no later than 55 Common Era, that little section in red is not original to Paul. It is earlier than Paul. Paul was given this. He received it. Before he wrote his letters, this pre-Pauline charismatic fragment was being distributed and handed on. From it, Paul informed his audience that Christ died for the sins of the Jesus group, was buried, was raised on the 3rd day, appeared to Cephas, and then to the 12. Please look at it very carefully. It's so brief. Where is all the other stuff that makes up the Passion story we are familiar with? Where's the stuff about Judas's betrayal? Where is the Garden of Gethsemane? What about Herod and Pontius Pilate, the chief priests? Where is the flogging or the crowning of thorns? What happened to Barabbas? Where is Simon of Cyrene and him helping Jesus carry his cross? For that matter, I don't see any mention of a cross anywhere. There is nothing said about criminals crucified to the right and left of Jesus. This account is so brief, it's too brief for Mel Gibson and any other filmmaker to make a movie out of it, huh? The lack of detail is remarkable. Short and sweet, how do you get Matthew chapter 26 verse 14 through chapter 27 verse 66 out of the tiny little 1 Corinthians chapter 15 verse 3b through 5, the pre-Pauline charismatic fragment? Folks, the New Testament documents evolved. This includes the Passion story. The Passion story evolved and grew over time. New details and embellishments got added over time. From where did these updated memories come? Certainly not from tape recordings and video footage. The Catholic Church, in official documents, has acknowledged the evolution of the New Testament documents and the Passion story. One can see these stages or levels of development in the gospel materials. Informed by critical scholarship, the teaching church acknowledges in official documents there has been a 3-stage process of development. Stage 1, Stage 2, and Stage 3. Understanding the New Testament documents and the Passion accounts they hold means you gotta understand these stages. It helps us explain why there are such significant differences between various Passion stories. For instance, why the Passion according to Mark only has a meager 15.5% similarity to the Passion according to John. By the way, that means these two different Gospel Passion accounts are in 84.5% disagreement. Adding details didn't begin with the Gospels. You already see it happening in Paul back in 1 Corinthians. To this very brief little text in red, Paul mentions other appearances besides those to Cephas and the 12. Paul says that the risen Jesus appeared to more than 500 believers at one time. He also says he appeared to James. Next he says he appeared to all the apostles, far more numerous than just the 12. Then finally, Paul says the risen Jesus appeared to Paul himself. Note the emphasis of Paul. He is completely focused on the risen Jesus. It's like he doesn't care about detailing the suffering and death Jesus endured. Paul is all about the risen Jesus. Paul believed that he would be alive when Jesus, cosmic Lord and Messiah, returned to establish Israelite theocracy. Of course, Paul died, and the theocracy, the kingdom of God, refused to manifest. So too, the first and second waves of followers of Jesus began dying, and theocracy was nowhere to be found. My friends, this caused a major crisis in the early Jesus groups that had to be addressed. And as believers began dying, theology began working. Focus shifted onto the significance of Jesus' own death. Shocking and humiliating details, too shameful, too embarrassing to remember before, now got recalled and took on newer significance. A brief narrative began to evolve about Jesus' passion, his sufferings, death and burial. He was arrested, put on trial, and crucified. Time passed. People desired to know further details. The story was therefore augmented and embellished and adorned with new details and updated memories. Jesus was anointed before his death. There was a farewell dinner or Last Supper. Was it a Passover meal like Mark, Matthew, and Luke said? Or was it just a farewell dinner like John said? There was also a betrayal and plots to have Jesus arrested and killed. The earliest written gospel we have is Mark, written about 70 Common Era. The document we call Matthew was written after, probably in the 80s. Luke was probably written sometime around the 90s. And most of what we would find in the version of John we read in our Bibles was probably set around 100 Common Era. Scholar John Pilch informs us that around the time that the Gospels were being composed, the longer Passion story had split into two different versions, two different branches of evolution, each with unique developed features. The version borrowed from and utilized by the documents called Mark and Matthew emphasized that in his suffering and death, Jesus fulfilled similar realities Israel suffered in passages such as Isaiah chapter 40 through 55, Psalms 22 and 69, and other Israelite scriptures. There had to have been another version of the evolving Passion story because we see in the documents called Luke and John that Jesus says so much more than he does in the Markan and Matthean Passion accounts. For example, should you compare the Last Supper accounts, when you read it in Mark and in Matthew, who follows Mark pretty closely, the scene is so simple. In both texts, Jesus speaks very little. But if you read the Last Supper story in Luke, it should be obvious that the author has given his Jesus much more dialogue. When we come to the Last Supper in John, it isn't a Passover meal, it's a farewell dinner. Moreover, John completely omits the institution of the Eucharist. We are instead given a foot washing that is entirely absent from the Synoptic Gospels. Why is this? Then, following the foot washing, are 4 chapters of dialogue between a very long-winded Jesus and his innermost circle of followers. From where does all this development come? Whether from memory of actual things Jesus said and did, but with a new context, or theological fiction being invented to bring out the meaning of Jesus, Pilch and other scholars claim that pietism is what basically gave rise to the evolution of the Passion story. John Pilch reminds us, though, that everything began with the resurrection of Jesus. Easter, and not the cross, was ground zero for everything in the New Testament. The gradual evolution of the Passion narratives was caused by the resurrection, by experiences with the risen one. Yes, that may sound counterintuitive. After all, doesn't the passion and death of Jesus chronologically precede his resurrection? How then can the Passion story be a follow-up to something that happened after? But if we put ourselves into the shoes of the first followers of Jesus, we would see clearly that without the resurrection, no one would have written anything other than a footnote about Jesus or his shameful death. Jesus was raised and exalted by the God of Israel, honored to the ultimate extent by the God of Israel. This is the only thing needed to empower Mediterranean believers in the first century. Only afterward did interest and concern grow for the events leading up to Jesus' death. My friends, everything in the Mediterranean cultural world of the Bible revolves around the values of honor and shame. Undeniably, the historical Jesus died crucified, the most shameful death imaginable and available to Roman cruelty. Jesus died in a Mediterranean way of executing the worst criminals. No matter how much good his movement had accomplished, no matter how many healings he had brokered for his fellow Israelites, Jesus' death was so shameful. All that came before had been wiped away. It was simply inconceivable for Israelites to imagine Jesus or anyone being favored by God after having been shamefully destroyed in such a manner. No one beloved by God would be permitted to be treated thus. Consequently, if all they had to go on was the crucifixion, all Israelites could conclude from that would be that Jesus assuredly had been cursed by God and rejected. But in raising and transforming the life of Jesus, anastasis, resurrection, God turned everything on its head. Resurrection was an honor higher than any human could receive from fellow humans, more even than that of earthly kings. As Pilch says, the resurrection of Jesus obliterated his shame. Pilch and others say that this great turnaround of God enabled the evangelist to reinterpret and recontextualize the Passion story. In the Gospel Passion accounts, Jesus always knows throughout his tortures he's in the right. His confidence is absolute. God is going to turn it all around. Doesn't matter how many betray and abandon him, how many false witnesses slander him, how rigged the court system was, how broken from tortures he was, or how much mockery he receives. The Matthean Jesus knows he is innocent, and God will show this in the end. But the Jesus we encounter in our New Testament is much more than just an innocent sufferer. The Matthean Jesus is presented as a real Mediterranean hero. He takes all the abuse without complaining. He never flinches. He never cries out. He never faints. Brutalized, flogged, insulted, crowned with thorns, even nailed to a cross. Like the ideal Mediterranean male, Jesus does not complain. When, following the Markan Jesus, the Matthean Jesus prayerfully says, my God, why have you forsaken me?" he alludes to Psalm 22. This psalm was the prayer of a faithful Israelite suffering unjustly, someone who will, eventually, be vindicated by God. The scene given in Matthew is a crowd taunting the crucified Jesus. The crowd is claiming that Jesus clearly, obviously, has been abandoned by God. Why do Western readers so often miss the point of the Passion narratives in the Gospels? Scholar John Pilch says that it is because we are blindfolded to them due to our Western cultural convictions. For us 21st century Western folks, suffering is not a means of honoring someone like a patron or anyone. It's just a nuisance. Medicine and human smarts, cleverness, can help people avoid suffering. Therefore, a Mediterranean male exhibiting patient, macho endurance when he could have used cleverness to flee and fight another day, what's so admirable about that? In our culture, the worship of science, scientism, is often a major religion with millions of adherents. To such people, what becomes of the significance of a Galilean male being raised from the dead? What relevance is there in the honoring of someone who had been devastatingly shamed? Our culture is not an honor-shame culture. We are all about discovering logical meaning and scientific certitudes. A challenge for all of us 21st century Western believers is discovering how we can follow the obedient Jesus, but in a way proper and possible to our cultural world so alien to his.